Story number 1. The house that takes them. There's something about Colorado that pulls you in. The mountains, the endless sky, the sense that the land itself is alive. I moved there in the early 1980s, chasing dreams of a simpler life with my husband, David. We were young, adventurous, and maybe a little reckless. That's probably why we ignored the warnings about the house. It was beautiful in a way only isolation could make it. A small, two-story cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. The realtor had been cagey about its history, but the price was right, and David was thrilled by the idea of living off the grid. "There's something off about this place," I said the first time we saw it. The way the trees seemed to lean toward the house, their branches gnarled and reaching, the way the air felt heavy, even in the sunlight. But David just laughed. "It's perfect," he said. "Exactly what we're looking for." We moved in late October, just as the first snow began to fall. By the time winter hit full force, the cabin felt like it belonged to us. We spent our days chopping wood, repairing the old structure, and making plans for the future. Felt like a dream, until the noises started. First, it was subtle. A creak in the floorboards, a faint thump from the second floor. "The house is settling," David said, his voice dismissive. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps pacing in the hallway at night, doors creaking open, even when we'd locked them tight. One night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I shook David awake, but by the time he opened his eyes, the cabin was silent again. "It's the wind," he said, pulling me close. "You're just spooking yourself." I wanted to believe him, but the wind didn't explain the scratches. They appeared on the walls overnight, deep gouges that seemed to spiral outward from the fireplace. David tried to blame it on animals, even though the marks were too large, too precise. I could see the fear in his eyes, even if he wouldn't admit it. And then there was the cold. It was always freezing in the cabin, no matter how high we piled the firewood. The warmth never seemed to reach us, and the air carried a damp, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. I started wearing layers to bed, but it didn't help. The cold was inside me, deep in my bones. Then came the shadows. It was David who saw them first. We were sitting by the fire one night, trying to ignore the endless creaks and groans of the house, when he froze, his eyes locked on the window. "There's someone out there," he whispered. I followed his gaze, but the yard was empty, just snow and darkness. "You're imagining things," I said, but the look on his face made my stomach drop. "I saw it," he insisted, "a figure, standing right there." From that night on, David changed. He stopped laughing, stopped brushing off the strange occurrences. He started pacing the cabin, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to the windows and doors as if expecting something, or someone, to come inside. And then he started hearing it. "The scratching," he said one night, his voice trembling. "It's coming from beneath the floorboards." I laughed nervously. "It's just mice." "David." "No," he said, his eyes wild. "It's not mice. It's something else." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't argue with him, not when I'd started hearing it too. Late at night, when the house was at its quietest, I'd hear the faint sound of nails dragging against the wood, slow, deliberate, as if whatever was down there was waiting for us to notice. The final straw came in early January. The storm outside was the worst we'd seen, the wind howling like a living thing. We were huddled by the fire, trying to keep warm, when the front door slammed open. The snow swirled inside, stinging my skin, but there was no one there. No footprints leading up to the porch, just the endless, blinding white. "Stay here," David said, grabbing the shotgun. He stepped outside before I could stop him, his figure swallowed by the storm. I waited for hours, my fear mounting with every passing minute. I called his name until my throat was raw, but he didn't answer. When the storm finally let up, I found the door wide open, Snow piling into the cabin. David was gone. The footprints I found outside didn't make sense. They started at the door, but instead of leading into the woods, they went around the cabin in endless, overlapping circles. I followed them until they disappeared at the tree line, leaving nothing but untouched snow beyond. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, clutching the shotgun. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words sharp and cruel. They knew my name. They laughed when I cried. When dawn came, I packed what little I could carry and walked until I found help. I never looked back. The locals didn't seem surprised when I told them what had happened. They just nodded solemnly, muttering about the house, about the family that had died there long ago. They said the snow had buried them alive, that their spirits still lingered, hungry for company. I never told them the truth about the last night, about the scratches I'd found on the inside of the bedroom door, about the final words David had whispered before he stepped outside. They won't let us leave. I sold the cabin to the state, and it's been abandoned ever since. They say no one goes near it anymore, not even the wildlife. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I think I can hear him calling for me. Or maybe it's the house itself, waiting for its next guest. Story number 2. The Woman in White. I came to Alaska to get away from the noise, the stress, the endless grind of city life. I wanted solitude, the kind you can only find in a place untouched by civilization. When I found the cabin, a lone structure buried deep in the Alaskan wilderness, it felt like fate, perfect retreat. The first few weeks were everything I hoped for. Mornings spent tracking game through the dense forest. Evenings by the fire with a cup of coffee and the howl of the wind for company. The nearest town was miles away, and the only human contact I had was with the pilot who'd flown me in. He'd looked at me strangely when I told him where I was staying. "Be careful out there," he'd said. "Winter in these parts, it gets into your bones." I didn't understand what he meant until the whispers started. It was late December, and the nights had grown impossibly long, the sun barely cresting the horizon before sinking again into darkness. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the walls of the cabin despite the roaring fire. That night, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, a faint, lilting voice, carried on the wind. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was soft, almost musical, but wrong somehow, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I shook my head, chalking it up to the wind or my imagination, and tried to go back to sleep. But the whispers came again the next night, and the night after that. By the third night, I couldn't ignore them. They seemed closer now, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was as if someone, or something, was calling to me. I told myself it was nothing, just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw the tracks. It was early morning, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across the snow. I stepped outside to gather firewood and froze. There, in the untouched snow just beyond the cabin, were tracks, long shallow furrows, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. They led from the edge of the forest to my cabin door, then back into the trees. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Gripping my rifle, I followed the tracks into the woods. The snow was deep, the air deathly still, and every step seemed louder than it should have been. The tracks went on, weaving between the trees until they simply stopped. No sign of what had made them, no broken branches or disturbed snow, just silence. I turned back, my skin crawling. That night, the whispers grew louder. I sat by the fire, clutching my rifle, as the voice seemed to circle the cabin, calling to me from every direction. The sound wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something ancient and cold. And then I saw her. It was just after midnight when I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned toward the window, and there she was, a woman, standing in the snow just beyond the cabin. Her skin was pale as the moon, her long white dress billowing in the wind. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a faint, frost-covered print. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was at the door, yanking it open, rifle in hand. "Who are you?" I shouted into the night. "What do you want?" The woman was gone. All that remained were footprints, leading from the window into the forest. They were impossibly small, delicate, and I couldn't help but think of a child playing in the snow. But these prints weren't playful. They were deliberate, purposeful, as if she was waiting for me to follow. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. The whispers turned to cries, soft, mournful wails that made my blood run cold. The tracks appeared every morning, closer to the cabin each time. Once, I found the faint outline of a hand pressed into the snow by my window, the fingers impossibly long and thin. I tried to leave, but the snowstorm had made the trail impassable. My only choice was to wait for the pilot to return. But the days dragged on, and the whispers refused to let me rest. The final night, I made the mistake of lighting a lantern and stepping outside. I wanted answers, needed them, if only to keep my sanity. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow glowing faintly under the moonlight. "I know you're out there," I called. My voice sounded small, insignificant in the vastness of the wilderness. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I saw her again, standing at the edge of the trees. She was closer this time, her dress fluttering in the windless air. Her face was clearer now, and what I saw made my stomach churn. Her eyes were sunken, her skin stretched tight over her skull. Frost clung to her hair and dress, and her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then she stepped forward. I stumbled back, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the lantern. "Stay back," I shouted, but she kept coming, her bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. Her lips twisted into a smile, cold, cruel, and devoid of life. I ran. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. The sound of her laughter, high and brittle, echoing through the trees. The sensation of hands, icy and skeletal, brushing against my back. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sobbing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I barricaded the door and huddled by the fire, waiting for dawn. When the pilot arrived 2 days later, I was barely coherent. I didn't tell him what happened. I couldn't. He took one look at me and didn't ask questions. As we flew away, I glanced back at the cabin. For a brief moment, I thought I saw her standing in the doorway, watching me with those hollow eyes. I'll never go back to Alaska, but sometimes, in the dead of winter, I hear the whispers again, soft, beckoning, promising warmth in the cold. And I know she's still waiting. Story number 3. The Haunting of the Vermont Cabin. There's something about Vermont in the winter. The snow seems heavier there, the nights darker, and the silence unbearable. I never believed in ghost stories, not until I spent a winter in that cabin. It was an old place, tucked away in the woods near Montpelier. A friend of mine, Mark, owned it and insisted I rent it when I told him I needed some solitude to finish my novel. "It's peaceful," he said, "the kind of place where you can hear yourself think." He didn't tell me about the history. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The cabin looked exactly as I'd pictured. Rustic, charming, and covered in a thick blanket of snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the air smelled of pine and cold. Inside, the wood-paneled walls and stone fireplace gave it a cozy, timeless feel. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, unpacked my things, and settled onto the couch with my laptop. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but the cabin felt warm and safe. I stayed up late, writing until my eyes grew heavy, then climbed into bed, feeling strangely content. But I woke up to laughter. It was faint at first, like the sound of a child playing just outside the window. I groggily glanced at the clock, 3:14 a.m., and pulled the blankets tighter around me. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the silent cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. No answer. For a long moment, I just sat there, straining to hear. Then it stopped. The silence was so sudden. It felt suffocating. I told myself it was the wind, a trick of the old cabin's acoustics. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. The sun was shining, and the cabin seemed far less menacing in the daylight. I went outside to gather some wood for the fire, and that's when I saw them. Dainty footprints, pressed into the snow near the front door. They were small, impossibly small, like a child's, but there hadn't been any children here, and they weren't mine. They led up to the door and stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That night, the cabin grew colder. I piled logs onto the fire, but it didn't seem to help. No matter how much I stoked the flames, the warmth never reached the corners of the room. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that didn't match the flickering firelight. And then came the laughter again. This time, it was louder, clearer. It echoed from the living room, spilling into the hallway and creeping into the bedroom. I froze, clutching the blankets, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept toward the living room. The fire had burned low, casting the room in an eerie, orange glow. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I swept the flashlight across the room, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw it. Near the fireplace, in the corner where the shadows gathered deepest, a figure stood, small and pale. It looked like a child, a little girl, her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. She was staring at me, her eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. I froze, unable to move or speak. The girl tilted her head, a slow, unnatural motion, and smiled. Her lips parted, and she whispered something, too soft for me to hear. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the icy air stinging my lungs. I stood there, staring back at the cabin, half expecting her to follow me. But the windows were dark, and the door remained closed. I didn't go back inside until morning. The next few days were a blur of fear and sleeplessness. The laughter came every night, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper. I found more footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the cabin. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision. A pale hand disappearing behind a door, the edge of a dress vanishing around a corner. On the fifth night, I tried to leave. The snowstorm had passed, and the road was clear enough to drive. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my bag. But when I stepped outside, I found my car buried in snow, far more than had fallen overnight. The footprints surrounded it, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking its prey. Defeated, I returned to the cabin. That night, the girl came closer. I was sitting by the fire, too scared to sleep, when I felt it, a sudden, bone-deep cold that seemed to radiate from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. She was standing at the edge of the room, her dark eyes fixed on mine. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and bloodied, leaving crimson smudges on the wooden floor. She took a step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed to the wall above the fireplace. I followed her gaze, my stomach twisting into knots. The words were carved into the wood, jagged and uneven, as if made by small, trembling hands. Help us. When I looked back, she was gone. I left the cabin the next morning. I didn't pack. I didn't even lock the door. I just got in my car and drove until the forest was nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror. Mark called me a week later, asking why I'd left so abruptly. I told him the truth, expecting him to laugh or call me crazy. But he didn't. Instead, he sighed and said, "You're not the first." I never asked what he meant. Some questions are better left unanswered. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, the faint sound of laughter, echoing in the distance, and I wonder if the little girl is still waiting for someone to help her. Story number 4. The Cabin in Black Hills. We didn't come to the Black Hills for ghost stories. It was supposed to be a weekend of skiing, drinking, and sitting by the fire with good friends. The cabin was the perfect find, cheap, secluded, and tucked away in a forest that looked like something out of a postcard. When I booked it online, the owner had warned me that cell service was spotty and the driveway could get icy in winter. But we were prepared, or at least, we thought we were. There were 6 of us, me, my girlfriend Emily, her best friend Jess, and 3 of our buddies, Ryan, Mike, and Chris. We'd driven up from Sioux Falls early that morning, winding through the snow-draped pines until we reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a 2-story structure, weathered but cozy, with a wraparound porch and a view of the endless forest. I remember thinking it was too perfect, too quiet. By the time we got settled, it was dark. Emily and Jess were in the kitchen unpacking groceries while the rest of us dragged firewood inside. The air outside was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and stays there. It made the cabin's warmth all the more inviting. That first night, everything felt normal, almost idyllic. We cooked dinner, played cards, and drank a little too much. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Around midnight, we all stumbled off to bed, ready for a full day of skiing in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. I don't know what woke me, maybe the wind, or the creak of the old floorboards, but I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. 3 taps, slow and measured. I sat up, my pulse quickening. It was late, far too late for anyone to be out in the woods. I glanced at Emily, still fast asleep, and debated whether to wake her. Instead, I slipped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and crept downstairs. The cabin was eerily quiet. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only sound was the faint whistle of the wind outside. I approached the door, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the wooden floor. Taking a deep breath, I opened it. No one was there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched except for our own tracks from earlier that evening. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, half expecting to see some animal darting away. But the forest was still, too still. I told myself it was just the wind, that old houses make noises, and went back to bed. But the knocking came again the next night, and the night after that. It wasn't just at the front door, either. The knocks started moving, first at the windows, then at the back door, then at the walls themselves. Always 3 taps, deliberate and slow. It was as if whatever was out there wanted us to know it was getting closer. On the 3rd night, we saw him. We were sitting around the fire after dinner, trying to ignore the knocks that had started again as soon as the sun went down. Jess was the first to notice it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch, barely visible in the swirling snow. "There's someone out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. We all froze, straining to see what she was pointing at. First, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then the figure moved a slow, shuffling step closer to the cabin. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on us. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, shouting, "Hey, who the hell are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it melted into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't sleep that night. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, and every so often, we'd catch glimpses of movement outside the windows, a flicker of shadow, a flash of pale skin. The next morning, we found the writing. It was carved into the wooden wall just beside the front door, the letters jagged and uneven, as if made by a trembling hand. "You are not welcome." None of us admitted it, but we all wanted to leave. The problem was the snow. A storm had rolled in overnight, burying the driveway and making the narrow road down the mountain impassable. We were trapped. That night, the knocks turned into pounding. It started just after sunset, a relentless thudding that echoed through the cabin like a drumbeat. We barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, but it didn't help. The pounding moved from wall to wall, circling the cabin, faster and louder with each pass. And then the whispers began. They came from everywhere at once, faint but unmistakable. Voices, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. Emily clung to me, her face pale with fear, while Mike and Ryan paced the room, looking for something, anything that could explain what was happening. Jess was the first to snap. "I saw him," she whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused. "He was at the window, watching me. He's waiting for us to come outside." We tried to calm her down, but it was no use. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. "We have to leave. We have to leave." By dawn, the storm had passed, and the road was clear enough to risk driving. We packed our things in record time, abandoning food and clothes in our haste to get out. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. He was standing in the trees, watching us. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. For a moment, I thought I saw him smile, a slow, malicious curve of his lips. Then he was gone, fading into the shadows like smoke. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. None of us talked about what had happened. Not then, not ever. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knocks again. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, and I wonder if we ever really left the Black Hills behind. Story number 5. The Smurl family cabin. We moved into the cabin in December. It was supposed to be an escape, a place where we could spend the holidays together, surrounded by snow and silence. My wife, Laura, found it online, a rustic retreat in the Pennsylvania woods. The listing had said, it sounded perfect, remote, peaceful, and just the thing to shake off the chaos of the city. But the cabin wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. The first night, the fireplace wouldn't light, and the pipes groaned whenever we turned on the water. The place was old, older than the photos let on. The wooden beams sagged, and the floors creaked underfoot, even when no one was walking on them. But it had charm, and I told myself the quirks were part of the experience. By the second night, I started to regret coming. It began with the footsteps, faint, almost imperceptible at first. I was sitting in the living room, reading by the dim light of a floor lamp, while Laura and the kids slept upstairs. The cabin was dead silent except for the occasional crackle of the old heater. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak from the ceiling above me. I froze, listening. Another creak, louder this time, then another, and another. Someone, or something, was walking around upstairs. "Laura," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you awake?" No answer. I stood, my heart pounding, and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was dark, lit only by the sliver of moonlight streaming through a small window. I pushed open the door to our bedroom and found Laura fast asleep. The kids' room was the same, 2 sleeping forms tucked under thick blankets. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. The old cabin was full of noises, the wind rattling the windows, the groan of the wood contracting in the cold. But as I turned to head back downstairs, I felt it, presence, heavy and oppressive, like something unseen was standing just behind me. watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. The holidays had been stressful, and I was exhausted. I went back to the living room, poured myself a drink, and tried to forget about it. But the feeling lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. The next few days were uneventful, though the cabin never quite felt right. Laura noticed it too. She started complaining about the cold, even when the heater was blasting. And she said she kept hearing strange noises, whispers in the hallway, the faint sound of laughter coming from the woods. We both laughed it off, trying to stay upbeat for the kids. But at night, when the cabin was quiet, I'd hear the footsteps again. It wasn't until the fourth night that things escalated. We were woken around midnight by a loud, frantic banging on the front door. It echoed through the cabin, so loud it made the walls shake. Laura and I bolted upright, hearts racing. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought with us, crept downstairs, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out onto the snow-covered porch. The air was bitterly cold, my breath clouding in front of me. There were no footprints leading up to the door, but in the fresh snow at the edge of the woods, I saw them, large, inhuman prints, too big to be a person, too misshapen to belong to any animal I could think of. They led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. "It's just an animal," I told Laura, though I didn't believe it myself. That night, none of us slept. The next morning, I called the rental company, demanding answers. The woman on the other end was apologetic but evasive. She assured me the cabin was safe and suggested the noises might be from raccoons or squirrels in the walls. But when I pressed her, she hesitated. Finally, she admitted the truth. The previous tenants had reported strange occurrences too. Sounds, sightings, and that overwhelming feeling of being watched. They said it might be something residual, she said hesitantly, like she didn't want to say the word. You know, energy from the past. I hung up, furious and terrified. Laura wanted to leave, but a snowstorm had rolled in overnight, blocking the road out of the woods. We were trapped. That night was the worst. The cabin came alive with noise, footsteps pounding upstairs, doors slamming on their own, and that same awful banging on the front door. The laughter started around midnight, a high-pitched, echoing giggle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The kids screamed, and Laura held them close, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed the bat and shouted into the darkness, "Leave us alone!" The laughter stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, from the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. It wasn't the kind of shadow you see when light hits an object. It was darker than the room itself, a patch of emptiness that seemed to pulse with malice. It slithered across the floor, moving impossibly fast, and disappeared into the wall. That was when we heard the voices. They whispered our names, over and over, taunting and mocking. "Laura, Daniel, come outside. Come play." The storm broke the next morning, and we packed our things in record time. The kids were too scared to ask questions, and I wasn't about to explain. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the upstairs window, I saw a face, pale, expressionless, and watching us go. We never spoke about it again. Not in detail. The cabin went back on the market a few months later, and I wondered if the next family would have the same experience. Part of me wanted to warn them, but what would I say? That something evil lived there? That the woods themselves seemed hungry? Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter, soft and distant, like it's calling to me from far away, and I wonder if the cabin is waiting for us to come back.